All right. Good morning, students. So this is the African novel, ELS 211. I'll be taking the course with Dr. Hoffman, and we have the course outline that specifies the topics to be treated and lecturers to teach them. So you get the course outline at the end of the class. Everyone is expected to have a copy of the outline so that they can read ahead. Remember that class attendance is now compulsory in the university. And you have to justify a certain percentage before you can be allowed to write exams. Apart from that, it is important for you to be in class so that you will know the progress that was made. And listen to the lessons and prepare for the exam. Since we are two on the course, since there are two lecturers in the course, you must take the CA of both lecturers. The CA is 30 marks. By CA I mean continuous assessment for 30 marks. So I will take 15 marks, and Dr. Fan will take 15 marks. And so you must watch out for either the tests or the assignment, and do that and submit so that you can get the CA for the two lecturers. The examination is for 70 marks, and when you put that together, you have 100 marks. It is hoped that if you attend your classes, write down the notes, participate in activities, read and study, there's no way you will not have a pass mark, which is 40. But actually 40 is low. I don't wish anyone to have 40. Actually wish everyone to score A in the course. And it's actually possible. Right? So you have to work hard to pass. Apart from that, I need to reiterate the need for you to register the first semester courses that you failed in year 1. Now that you are in first semester year 2, please tell your friends and family that if they had any failed course in year 1 first semester, that it is compulsory now that they are in year 2 first semester. You should register those repeat courses first before they register year 2 courses first semester. Please spread the message, because if you do not do that, you are doing yourself more harm than good. Because we will still count those courses for you. We'll still score you and add the credit hours for you, which is not good. So take note of that. For my CA, I will divide everyone into a group, and I will assign topics to the group, and the group will go and do research and present a paper to the class at the end of the day. That is your CA. I'm going to start right away. People will have normally divide it into groups of 5. So I don't know how many you are. I understand this class should be over 100. Okay? It's over 100. Okay, maybe we can have 10. 10. I will give you 10 groups. Okay, we can have 7. Can work with 7 per group. 7 is a good number to work with. So what I'll do is that I'll give you a number. I'll give you a number from 1 to 7. I'll give you a number from 1 to 7. All those who belong to 1 will be in group 1. And all those who belong to 2 will be in group 2. And so on and so forth. So I'll start on my right hand. Okay, because I always need to start on the right hand. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, 7. 7. Right? 7 starts at the 2, right? And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. From Joy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. From Faith, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1. Okay? So hold your number and everybody that took number 1 should meet. Okay? You can just call yourself the amazing one. You gather. Amazing one. Come together. Incredible 2. Incredible 2. Alright? Gather here. Or the 3 musketeers. Or the 3 can call themselves the 3 musketeers. When they gather. Or if they don't like the 3 musketeers, they can call themselves the 3 witches. They gather. Group 4. And so on and so forth to 7. So you meet, write your name, choose a leader, submit the name to the course rep. The name will come to me, I will sign the topic, and then you start. So it's good to start early. Okay? So when we have more of friends and family joining us, we will assign the numbers. I know we stopped at 1. Okay? And the next people coming will be from 2. Alright, so we move on. So we want to talk about the introductory issues for the African novel. Talking about the introductory issues for the African novel. So the first topic we want to take is the general introduction, social, cultural, and historical background to the African novel. Social, cultural, and historical background to the African novel. That's our first topic. Social, cultural, and historical background to the African novel. So the African novel has come to stay as one of the most important prose genres in African literature. One of the most important aspects of the prose genre, one of the sub-genres of prose in African literature. We have many great names in the African novel today, writing today. We have many great names in the African novel writing today. All who have attained global acclaim, meaning that they have been recognized worldwide for their writing, meaning that they are not local champions. The African novel is recognized worldwide today as a formidable body of work coming out of Africa in our time. When you want to mention the African novel, you have to mention names like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ayikwe Ama. These are the strong voices in the African novel. We have to talk about Nawal El-Saadawi. We have to talk about Chimamanda Adichie. Who is alive and still writing. There are others. Lalama Dako. So we might take it for granted that the African novel is a fully fledged subgenre of prose literature coming to Africa at this time. You might take it for granted that we have a subgenre of prose fiction called the African novel. But some decades ago, this was not so easy to assume. It was not so easy to assume that there was a genre called the African novel. It's difficult to say that with certainty, and I will tell you why in a short while. So it has not always been that people had to believe that we had the African novel the way we believe with certainty today. So there was a time when the African novel struggled for recognition. There was actually a time when people doubted the existence of the African novel. There was a time when the African novel struggled for recognition. There was a time when people doubted the existence of the African novel. Who wondered whether there was a genre called the African novel. Why was this so? This was so because the Eurocentric critics did not believe that Africa had its own novel. The Eurocentric critics did not believe that Africa had our own novel. They faulted the idea that Africa could have had our own novel. They thought it was not possible, that it was not realistic to say that Africa had a novel. When we talk about Eurocentric critics, we're talking about critics based in Europe, educated in Europe, the Europeans, the European intellectuals who came to Africa on their civilizing mission. Alongside the missionaries and the administrators, the colonial administrators. And they started writing about Africa when Africans did not have the means to do so. So these European intellectuals in the literary sphere did not believe that Africa could have had its own literature. Some of these Eurocentric critics are Adrian Roscoe, John Povey, and Charles Larson. Their views on Africa and our literature were based on the colonial assumption. Their views on Africa and African literature were based on the colonialist assumptions. And what is the colonialist assumption? The colonialist assumption is that Africa was incapable of producing anything imaginative prior to colonial encounter. Africa was incapable of producing anything imaginative prior to the colonial encounter. That's the colonial assumption, the colonialist assumption. The colonialist assumption is that Africa was incapable of producing anything imaginative, anything creative before the coming of the colonial masters. They assumed and wanted the world to believe that until they arrived in Africa in their civilizing mission, we were all living in darkness. We were all living in cultural darkness. The colonialists assumed that before they arrived on the shores of Africa for their civilizing mission, that Africans were living in cultural darkness, or if you like, cultural wilderness. And that it was after they had arrived and introduced the civilization system and processes that Africa began to pick up with the rest of the world. And so Africa could not have had literature before colonialism. That is the basic colonialist assumption. And that is what they told everyone about us. So the plausibility, the seeming plausibility in the assumption by the Eurocentric critic is seen in the fact that the colonial masters brought Western education to Africa. The plausibility of the colonialist assumption, the seeming plausibility, is seen in the fact that the colonial masters brought Western education to Africa. Although, of course, you must understand that Western education is not only the form of education, not the only form of education, right? But they have a point because they introduced the education system in Africa, and through that education system, African writers, or let me say African youths, were introduced to European and English literature, like the Bible, which were taught in the missionary schools, like Shakespeare, which were taught and dramatized in this school. They were exposed to Western literature. And when they started writing, the colonial masters claimed that what these Africans were writing were not their own literature, but it was Western literature. It was an extension of Western literature because the Europeans taught them how to write, or taught them literature. So this explains basically why the Eurocentric critics saw African literature as an extension of European or English literature. This explains why the Eurocentric critics viewed African literature as an extension of European literature. We brought you education, taught you our literature, and now you are writing. Whose literature is that? It's not yours, it's ours. That is the argument. Okay? Probably because if we did not teach you, you would have known how to write. Because as far as they're concerned, literature is all about writing. The writing. Another problem that made it easy for the Eurocentric critics to ascribe whatever our writers wrote to Europe and English was the language question, was the language problem. Because our writers wrote in English, or they wrote in Portuguese, wrote in French, depending who their colonial masters were. Right? If their colonial masters were from France, they would write in French, because when the colonial masters came, they simply imposed their own language on the people. When the English came to Africa, they imposed English on the people that they colonized. And so today, you have to speak English somehow in order to be considered educated and even respected. Because if you speak and then you make mistakes, people start laughing. And then they start doubting your education. So they did this to the utter disregard for indigenous language of the people. Except whenever it was necessary, maybe to spread the gospel. That's when they would think about the indigenous language. So apart from that, government, administration, everything was done in English. And English was imposed. The same thing in the French colonies. So inevitably, when the Africans started writing, they wrote in English. Right? And because they wrote in English, the Europeans claimed that the literature was English literature. And the literature was English literature. It was not African literature because it was written in the language of the colonial masters. The question should then be asked, should the language of the literature determine the ownership, the origin of that literature? This is the question that ought to be asked. Should the language of the literature determine the ownership and the origin of that literature? We'll answer that question as we go on. So the mistakes that the colonial masters made, the Eurocentric Christians made, the mistakes they made were two. One, they ignored literature in the oral mode. They ignored literature in the oral mode. They ignored literature in the oral mode. Or they dismissed literature in the oral mode. And rather emphasized written literature. They rather emphasized written literature because they came with the written tradition. And second mistake they made was that they thought that the language question was enough to justify the origin of a literature without considering the sensibilities expressed in the language. Without considering the sensibilities expressed in the language. They thought that the language question was enough to justify the origin of a literature without considering the sensibilities in which the literature is written, or the sensibilities with which the literature is written. Those were the mistakes of the Eurocentric critics. So, because African literature was oral, they dismissed it as not being literature. They saw African literature as oral, monothematic, monostructural, hybrid, and mimetic. The Eurocentric critics saw African literature as oral, monothematic, always dealing with one theme, monostructural, having only one structure, hybrid, and mimetic. Hybrid, that means it draws from different traditions, all of them which might not be East Daroon, and not be African. Hybrid, it draws from different traditions, most of which might not be African. Right? Hybrid. It's not pure, it's not purely African. Right? All the materials are not made in Africa. So it's hybrid, taken from different sources. And mimetic. Mimetic in the sense that it's not original, not that it copies reality. It's not original. It copies from another person. Alright? Copies from probably the Europeans themselves. Not original to Africa, but it is copied from the Europeans, from the English. I will have been able to explain some of those hard terms in that expression. They saw African literature as what? Oral, monothematic, monostructural, hybrid, and mimetic. The Eurocentric critics saw African literature as oral, that's not written down, so because it was not written down, they dismissed it as not being literature enough. Right? Monothematic, dealing with only one theme or one issue. Monostructural, having undeveloped structures. It's not complex. It's not complex. Literature is not complex enough to be called literature in the European tradition, in Western tradition. Hybrid, not purely African, drawn from different sources, mostly European sources. And mimetic, copying from the masters. And who were the masters? They were the colonial masters. So those were the allegations leveled against the African novelty. Okay? Those were the allegations. As reported by Monet Benzi. Reported by Monet Benzi. In a 2015 article, entitled in a 2015 article entitled African Literature Still in the Dark. African Literature Still in the Dark. This is just yesterday, 2015. African Literature Still in the Dark. Where do you normally find the dark? In the court. So African literature is still standing trial. And this article was published in 2015. Still standing trial, still on trial. Okay? African literature still in the dark. Colon. A deconstructive strategy for Eurocentric hegemony. A deconstructive strategy for Eurocentric hegemony. A deconstructive strategy for Eurocentric hegemony. As reported by Monet Benzide, 2015, in an article entitled African Literature Still in the Dark, a deconstructive strategy for Eurocentric hegemony. Charles Lasson points out African novels in general and Amos Titola's The Palm Wine Drinkard in particular as lacking logic, rationality, and consistency. Charles Lasson points out African novels in general and Amos Titola's The Palm Wine Drinkard in particular as lacking logic, rationality, and what? Consistency. So you can see this is the type of jibes and attacks that African literature was exposed to in the hands of Western critics. Charles Lasson points out African novels in general and Amos Titola's The Palm Wine Drinkard in particular as lacking what? Logic, rationality, and what? Consistency. You have to learn how to write fast. Train your mind to get what is said, and then you write it down. Aim to write points. You were taught note-taking and note-making. So I will take that one more time for the last time. As reported by Monet Benzide in a 2015 article entitled African Literature Still in the Dark, a deconstructive strategy for Eurocentric hegemony. Charles Lasson points out African novels in general and Amos Titola's The Palm Wine Drinkard in particular as lacking what? Logic, rationality, and consistency. And I said that this was the type of attack and jibes that African literature was exposed to in the hands of Eurocentric critics like Charles Lasson. There were other charges because we have to sustain that court metaphor, right? We have to sustain that court metaphor here because African literature stands in trial. So there were other charges against African literature and indeed the African novel. Some of them were that African literature promotes superstition and magic. African literature promotes superstition and magic. African literature promotes superstition and magic. African literature dwells on unrealistic issues. African literature dwells on unrealistic issues and ignores universal and human concern. Other charges were that African literature promotes superstition and magic, dwells on unrealistic issues, and ignores universal and human concerns. As they were criticizing our folk tales, our epic tales like sagas, our myths, and our legends, such as you will find in the Palm Wine Drinker. They dismissed them as not being good stories. All right? African literature promotes superstition and magic, dwells on unrealistic issues, and ignores universal and human concerns. So, apart from this, the other allegations leveled against the African novel, and by extension, African literature, had to do with the issue of language. Which we have already talked about. They argue that if you write in our language, then that literature is ours, not yours. Okay? Now, even as we speak, these issues keep recurring in our discussion of African literature, and indeed the African novel. Because it has even made some writers to stop writing in English and go back to writing in their indigenous languages. Because they felt that the point was so strong that if you write in another man's language, then the literature is not yours, it belongs to the other man's country. So someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o decided at a point that he would no longer write in English. At least he would. He will first of all write in his indigenous Gikuyu language before it is translated into English. And some other writers are taking after him. So that is the question. Should we cease from writing in English and go back to write in our indigenous languages? What do you think, Arthur? Okay. All right, we'll just take a response from one guy and one gal. One guy and one gal who would like to respond to the question. Should we cease from writing in English and go back to writing in our indigenous language? One guy and one gal. Answer the question. Anyone? Okay, what's your name? Amanda. Oh, it's a popular name. Okay, so what is your view? You should continue writing in English. To gain wider wide readership. Okay, so that's the reason, because I was going to ask you why. Okay, good. So the guy says that we should write in English. Are you speaking on behalf of the guys? Okay, one lady, one girl. The guy has spoken, so we need a girl. Should we continue writing in English? Should we go back to writing in our indigenous languages? The ladies don't have an opinion. They should choose their representative. Where to represent them. Someone has to speak. It's very simple. You just have to give your opinion. Right? Okay, what's your name? Mary Achiba. To write in English. At the same time. That would be very tedious. Okay. So the argument rages on. So while writers like Gugu wa Thiong'o reacted by going back to write in indigenous language, a writer like Chinua Achebe thought that he had a better solution. And we are going to discuss that solution in due course. Because he felt that the English language was imposed on him by the colonial masters in the course of educating the natives, and that it is inevitable for him then to use it when it is time to write. He has no other option than to resort to the English language at the moment of writing, because it was imposed on him and it does not have any other medium of self-expression that is sophisticated like the English language. Some of you, if you're asked to write in your indigenous language, you will struggle. You'll suffer. You won't even struggle, you will suffer. Right? Okay? You say, turn in your paper in a Bible. You'll say Shege. Right? It might be easier speaking, but to turn in a paper in a Bible. Oh my God. It's going to be a wonderful thing. But to do it in English is just so normal for you. Alright? It's just so easy for you. It's as if you're English children. Right? You're so good with it. So that Achebe was realistic. Achebe took a realistic position and said, this language was imposed on me. And so at the point of self-expression in writing, I cannot but resort to the language. Because it's the language in which I'm good at. I was not trained in Igbo. I could not write fluently in Igbo. I cannot command all the metaphors in Igbo and all the idiomatic expressions in Igbo. But I have mastered the idiomatic expressions in English. And so at the point of writing, I have to resort to the language that was imposed. But then he went further than that. He went further than that to say that he has done something to that English. He has done something to that English so that the English has changed from what it was when it was first given to him. He has been able to make that language, that English, his own English, and no more the English of the colonial masters. And so he has been able to make that English to serve the purposes of his linguistic expression and the purpose of expressing his cultural sensibilities. In other words, as far as Achebe is concerned, he has been able to nativize the English. He's been able to do what? Nativize the English. Make that English to speak in the way that people in his environment will understand, and not in the way that the Europeans will understand. So it is no more the English that the Europeans can appreciate, but the English that Africans can appreciate. So you will see that in the study of English language in social situation in Nigeria, we often distinguish the type of English that we speak in Nigeria from the one that the Europeans speak in the UK. They are not the same. They are not the same. Because the English language tends to pick up the sensibilities of any environment it goes to, and assumes the identity of that environment. Which is why we have many Englishes in the world today. Which is why we have what? Many Englishes in the world today. We don't have one English anymore. We have Englishes. For instance, the Europeans, the English people who left England to the United States, in the 18th century, took English there, but it is not the same English that they took there that they are still speaking today. The English has changed, and that's why we have American English today, which is different from British English. It is why we say that wherever the English language goes, it takes up the identity of the new environment. So the English that left Europe to America was transformed by the Americans. And today they speak a different subset of the language, different dialect of the language, which is not British English anymore. So they call it North American English. And if you listen to the way the African Americans speak English, you will see that it's different from the way the white Americans will speak English. So that gives you another sub-dialect of the English language, and they're not the same. And when you come to Africa, the English also assumes another identity. So we also have African English. In African English, we have Nigerian English. Under Nigerian English, we have Yoruba English. We have Ibibio English and Igbo English. Okay? And sometimes when these Englishes are spoken to the British, they just stand and stare. They don't understand. But it is their English. Because we have been able to change You have been able to change it in ways that they don't understand English. So it's no longer their language. It's now ours. Okay? Take, for instance, pidgin. Okay? Recently, we even find some white people who are struggling to learn pidgin because they like it. So Achebe aims to write with this transformed English that bears the sensibilities of his cultural environment. And Achebe believes that when he writes in that kind of English, it is no more British English, it is now Nigerian English, and so they cannot claim his literature as theirs. That is the argument. In literature, we advance argument, so you must always follow the logic of the argument. So Achebe, alongside other African critics, struggled for years to save African literature from the grips and the strangulation of the Western critics, because they wanted to deny that we ever had literature. How did they do this? In the area of language, we already explained what Achebe said, the stand Achebe took. But there were other critics who also countered other charges leveled against African literature and African novel, so that we can proudly say that we have the African novel today. We must acknowledge these guys and for the battle that they fought, all right, to save our literature for us. And as young African critics and literary critics coming up, you must be aware of the issues so that anytime the discussion comes up, you will know how to defend your literature. Okay? So African writers and African critics challenged the European views on African literature. They stood up and said, no, we have to fight this battle. Okay? There were African writers and critics who stood up to defend African literature from the charges, from the allegation of the colonial masters, who thought that we should not have our literature because it was written in English, because it was oral, and so on and so forth. These writers were Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Biola Irele, and Chinwezu, and others. Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Abiola Irele, and Chinwezu Eto'o. Chinwezu Eto'o. Eto'o means and others. Eto'o, Latin for and others. Okay? I think that if you go to the library, if you ever one day, right, visit the library, okay, either by accident or by chance, like you were passing by there and somebody called you and said, come to the library. You might see this text written by Chinwezu Eto'o, right? It's entitled Towards the Decolonization of African Literature. This is entitled Towards the Decolonization of African Literature by Chinwezu Etoh. It was published in 1985. It was published in 1985. Towards the decolonization. Write it down so that any day you go to the library, you can check for it, right? It might not be this year or the next, but whenever, whenever that great event happens, you can check for it. Towards the decolonization of African literature, it ought to be there. Because in that book, you have the defense that Chinwezu and the other writers put up against the Eurocentric critics. And what is the defense? What is the defense? Remember that the Europeans were the first to write about Africa. So they told a lot of lies. The Europeans were the first to write about Africa, and so they told a lot of lies about Africa. Because we didn't have a voice, we didn't challenge them. But when our critics were educated and they started reading, they discovered that these things said about us were lies, and they started challenging them. A kind of counter discourse. Kind of what? Counter discourse. To counter what they said about us. Okay? And today we are still doing this counter discourse because the lies were deep. Somebody even tells you that the color black is usually associated with the devil. Right? That's the point where they will tell you that the color black is usually associated with the devil. That anything black is devilish. And you start hating yourself, hating your brother, hating everything that you do. It's not being good. And whenever you see where they sell skin lightening cream, you spend all your money and you buy it because you don't want the color black. When the Europeans, are even looking for ways they can have black skin because they know how beneficial it is. They know how important it is to have black skin. And they lie to you that everything black is devilish, it's evil. And so you wash your own away to the detriment of your health. So that's how deep the lies went. Okay, so now we know that if you're black, you're actually beautiful. If you're black, you are the most beautiful creature on the surface of the earth. You're amazing. So researches by African intellectuals led them to discover that African writing goes back to antiquity. African writing goes back to where? Antiquity. After all, as Ayukwema would say, we are not a people of yesterday. Alright? We are not a people of yesterday. Before the Europeans populated the earth, Africans had existed for many, many years. So we are not a people of yesterday. So African literature and African novel goes back to antiquity. By antiquity, we mean the classical period. By that we mean the classical period. So for them to say that they were the ones who brought literature to us was wrong, because African literature could be identified in the classical period. When did the Europeans also were writing? Because we are not the people of yesterday. We were there, even before them. So you can imagine the destruction that they did in Egypt and all those black civilizations, because the early Egyptians were black. But today, if you go to Egypt, you will believe that there were never black people in Egypt. But the original Egyptians, the people who did those great things, all those pharaohs were black people. They were not white people. So we're talking about a complete destruction of a civilization and transformation, and then telling lies on top of it. Buried. The truth is buried. Now being on earth now. Because they want to ascribe those achievements to white people, which is wrong, to make you believe that your ancestors never did anything creative and imaginative, and so that you are a dunce, which is not true. Because whatever you believe about yourself, that will manifest. They know the power. The Europeans knew the power of the mind, and because of that, colonialism was mostly a mental battle. It's a battle of the mind. First of all, before it was a battle of, before it was a physical battle, it was first of all a battle of the mind. Just make the person feel inferior. Make him feel nothing. Like it's nothing. That's all. It'll be nothing. So two works that are cited by Abiola Irele. I'll give you this after the class. In his article, Introduction, Perspectives on the African Novel, two works that are cited by Abiola Irele in his article, Introduction, Perspectives on the African Novel, to justify that the African novel goes back to antiquity, are two works cited by Abiola Irele in his article, Introduction, Perspectives on the African Novel, to justify the African novel goes back to antiquity, are, I'm going to mention the words now. One, The Golden Ass. The Golden Ass by Apuleius. You write the title of the book, you underline it. One, The Golden Ass by Apuleius. Two, Ethiopica by Heliodorus. These are novels in antiquity that justify that African novels existed, just when the Westerners were also having their own civilization. The idea that Africa did not have writing prior to colonization is faulty in many ways. The idea that Africa did not have writing, any form of writing, prior to civilization is faulted in many ways. It's faulted in many ways. The idea that Africa did not have any form of writing before colonization can be faulted in many ways. For instance, Alan Richards, in an article entitled Africa and Writing, says, and I quote, "Africa is everywhere inscribed." Africa is everywhere inscribed. Africa is everywhere described. It's actually Ricard. Africa is everywhere inscribed. Alan Ricard. Africa is everywhere inscribed. What does it mean by that? What it means by that is the fact that in pre-colonial Africa, we had our own system of writing. In pre-colonial Africa, Africa had its own system of writing. Though it may not have developed into intelligible communication system like the one that the Europeans brought. We were not completely bereft of our system of writing. Africa was not completely bereft of its own system of writing. To say that Africa did not have a system of writing before the colonial masters came is complete falsehood. African writing in the pre-colonial era existed mostly in the form of signs, pictures, symbols, and drawings, etc. African writing in the pre-colonial era existed mostly in the form of what? Signs, S-I-G-N-S, pictures, symbols, and drawing. Apart from this, the ancient Egyptians who were black people, had a form of writing known as hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics.
A writing system consisting of hieroglyphs, a system of writing consisting of hieroglyphs,
starts here, then you add S.
hieroglyphs, which means sacred carving.
Sacred carving. They were very religious people, the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians.
Sacred carvings, which means sacred carving. Or
The word of God. God's words. God's words.
the ancient Egyptians had the hieroglyphics, as we have said, a system of writing consisting of what? Hieroglyphs, meaning sacred carving, or what? The gospel. Alright? The God's words. The word of God. So you could see where the Westerners took the word of God from. Took it from the ancient Egyptians, from the God's words. Right? The intellectuals went to ancient Egypt to study, and then they stole the ideas back to Europe. They sat under the feet of black Africans, intellectuals, and learned from them. After that, they went to Europe and claimed that they were the owners of the ideas. People like Aristotle and Plato claimed that they knew what they knew, but they were taught in Egypt. They were taught by black Egyptians. Because you see, when Africa was civilized, Europe was still in darkness. Primordial darkness. When Africa had universities. Okay. So, hieroglyphics is a combination of pictures, sounds, and other symbols to communicate meaning. Hieroglyphics is a combination of what? Pictures, sounds, and other symbols to communicate meaning. Hieroglyphics is a combination of pictures, sounds, and other symbols to communicate meaning. I have mentioned two forms of pre-colonial African writing to counter the European idea that Africa did not have any form of writing before the colonial masters came. I have mentioned the idea of Ellen Rickard that said Africa is everywhere inscribed, talking about our various signs. Even the one that Onoka uses to represent his death on the wall. It's a form of writing because it gives him order. Makes him take stock. And then you have the third example that I want to give you of pre-colonial African writing is the Nsibidi script. The Nsibidi script. The third instance of Africa's pre-colonial writing is the Nsibidi script. The Nsibidi script. It was a system of communication deployed by the elite members of society. Deployed by the elite members of society. The elite. What you call the elite. The elite members of society. For special communication purposes, like in war, to pass intelligence, like in war, to pass intelligence, or used by certain members of secret societies, like the Ekpe society, or the Ekpo society. Because they needed to exclude others from what they were saying, right? Because they needed to exclude the others from what they were saying. If Ekpe initiates meet, they will discuss using their language, okay? So that ordinary people in society, because they were the elite of society, they were like the police of society. So they need to have their own intelligence language to pass messages among themselves so that the ordinary people will not understand. So that ordinary people will not pick up that security message. That's why we had the NCBD script. They were the people who protected societies. So that was what destroyed the language, because not everybody knew. So it died a natural death. It just disappeared when those societies ceased to function in the wake of colonialism. All right? When everyone became Christians and saw the light, everyone saw the light and became Christians and abandoned the old ways and started practicing the new ways, moving away from darkness to the light of God. All right? Because all things have passed away and everything is now new. Okay? So then CBD is also called proto-writing. Proto-writing in CBD. Proto-writing. Made up of mostly pictograms. Made up of mostly pictograms in CBD. Called proto-writing. It's made up of mostly what? Pictograms. As well as logograms. Pictograms, logograms, and syllabograms. Right? It's made up of pictograms, logograms, and syllabograms. It is said to be the oldest form of writing in Africa. So even we in this part of the world, because the NCBD is identified among the Efik and the Ibibio, and some parts of Igbo, we are not a people of yesterday. It's the oldest form of writing in Africa. And somebody comes to say that you never had a form of writing, and you believe, and you don't ask questions. It is the oldest form of writing in Africa. Incidentally, the people who said that we didn't have writing are the ones who are in custody of this NCBD script today. And we who were the original authors, we don't even know. Some of us, you must have heard it for the first time today, that we had NCBD script by our forefathers who used it to communicate intelligence, secret messages. But the white people who said we didn't have language, they came, they studied this in CBD script, curated it, and carried it to their libraries in the Western world. So you want to know anything about CBD script today, where do you go to? You go to the West. Go to a place like Florida in the US, and some Western universities. That's where you see in CBD scripts. They have studied it, wrote about it. They are the ones who have the knowledge and everything about it today. Over here, we don't know anything about it. We don't even go to our libraries, we might not see it. So give me one book on CBD. We have. But they have it in the West because they value knowledge, anything knowledge. Okay? Even if it had to be for them to infiltrate the secret societies, they infiltrated the secret societies to learn, just to learn the language. That's what they did. Whatever it took for them to infiltrate those secret societies, they did. Even if they can remember, if they say you have to give 2 goods, 5 goods, 7 goods, and drinks, they will give. And then they joined the meetings, recorded what those people were saying, learned, studied everything, wrote everything down, took them back to their country. Right? And you, when you see those Ekwe society people, you start finding them. You don't ask them, what are you people normally? What do you people normally do? You say, I bind you. Any Ekwe society in this environment, I bind you. Alright? Any Igbo person, as I'm not your friend, don't greet me. You don't go and ask, this Igbo thing that you do, this chant that you normally do, chant it, let me hear. Want to record it. What does it mean? And the person will say, give me a drink. Say, okay, I have 1 bottle of drink. Record it. You don't have the idea. All you do is to bind and cast. Okay? But a white person will say, what exactly? There's something happening there. Let me go and find out. And they'll find out. And it becomes knowledge. Whereas you threw it away. The same European who brought the church and the Bible to you, the same European who took our CBD script back to Europe. And if you want to study CBD script now, you have to pay your way to Europe. Why you have the Bible? Okay? Take the world and give me Jesus. You don't know anything about yourself. You know how rich and how beautiful your path was. How great it was. Simply hold on to the Bible. Alright? While they took your lands, you were holding on to the Bible. So I have this Bible, you can take the land. It's not important. I don't want anything from this world. I don't want anything from the world. The Bible is enough for me. Okay? So at this point, you have to note the 2 schools. You have to note the 2 schools. You have to note the 2 schools. The 2 schools of thought, or the 2 schools in the study of African writing. The 2 schools of thought, the 2 schools of thought, or the 2 schools in the study of African writing. There are the inclusive school and the exclusive school. The inclusive school and the exclusive school. The inclusive school and the exclusive school. So if you want to learn about the NCBD scripts, you can Google it. Just NCBD scripts. You can learn some things about it, right? Like if you want to write mirror, you want to write mirror in CBD, right? This is what you do. Mirror in CBD, like this. This is mirror, right? This one represents a journey. You're going on a journey. This is journey. Okay? If you are sailing in the sea, this is voyage. Okay? I have one here that shows love and unity. Love and unity. Love and unity. If you want to learn more, you can go online. So for the inclusive school, the idea is that for the inclusive school, the idea is that those pre-colonial writings should be included as those writings should be included as part of the body of African literature, even though it did not develop into intelligible writing. Even though it did not develop into intelligible writing. The idea is to show that Africa would have developed its writing if not that it was interrupted by the colonial incident. The idea is that Africa would have, the idea of including this pre-colonial, almost illiterate writing as part of our body of literature, literary history, is to show that Africa would have developed its own system of writing if Africa was not interrupted by the colonial incident. If Africa was not interrupted by the colonial incident, Africa would have developed its own system of writing. Now, for the exclusive school believes that these pre-literate writings, as it were, should not be included as part of Africa's literary history. Part of Africa's literary history. I believe that they should not be included as part of Africa's literary history. And the reason is that they want to say that African literature began in the oral mode, just like all other literatures in the world. That African literature began in the oral mode, just like all the other literatures in the world started in the oral. Because you see, the colonial masters who came and dismissed our oral literature as not being literature enough had to admit that they did not just start their own literature by writing. Okay? Because no member of the human race began by writing first. After all, speech precedes writing. Speech precedes writing. Speech precedes writing. Speech precedes writing. Means that you first of all speak before you write. Okay? Have you ever seen a baby that was born with a pen? Just born and doesn't start writing. First of all, speak before you write. So speech precedes writing. So even the white people started their literature with what? It's speaking, oral literature. Oral literature precedes written literature. So the exclusive school says we should exclude this pre-literary writing from our literary history, so that we can claim that just like any other literature in the world, African literature began in the oral mode, in oral literature. And oral literature is a type of literature that is not written down. Okay? Oral literature is not written down, it is spoken. It is passed on through speech, through the spoken word, from generation to generation. So our literature began with myths, with legends, with folk tales, with proverbs, with chants, dance, storytelling session. That was how our literature started. The substance of African literature is found in oral tradition. The substance of African literature is found in the African oral tradition. African oral tradition. Our songs, our stories, our folk tales, our legends, our myths, passed on from generation to generation. That is our literature. And it is the basic ingredient. It is the basic ingredient with which modern African literature is written. We use our oral tradition to write modern African literature. And by modern African literature, we mean the literature that is written down as a result of the colonial encounter. By modern African literature, we mean the literature that is written down as a result of the colonial encounter. But what makes our literature African is because it makes use of our oral tradition. It makes use of our myths, our legends, our folk tales, our songs, our dances, our rituals, our chants, as the basic ingredients of that literature. Our proverbs, okay, and all other forms of oral literature. Therefore, it is wrong for the white people to have said that we do not have literature. Because in all that these you know what our writers have done in their works, like Achebe. If you read Things Fall Apart, Palm Wine Drinkard, you'll see that the substance of the story, even though the story is written, the gist of the story, the sensibilities of the story, captures our oral literature. Okay? It's African. The sensibilities of the story are African because they are written using African oral tradition. In the stories, you find our myths, our folk tales, our proverbs, our idioms. Our tongue twisters, they're out there. Our wrestling matches, our struggle with the forces of existence, they're all there. Okay, so maybe we pause here for now on this course. We take about 5 minutes break and then we start 241.